In this podcast, we consider the final pieces of legal and ethical issues facing ski patrollers. We wrap up Chapter 1. Our objectives are really to define these legal terms: abandonment, duty to act, negligence, breach of duty, consent, assault, and battery, and describe the following concepts related to patient consent: informed consent versus expressed consent versus implied consent and versus minor consent. Let's begin. Whether on duty or off, if you are in uniform, you may trigger the doctrine of public reliance. That is, if you give members of the public a reasonable expectation that you are able to provide first aid services, such as wearing your patrol vest even if you're off duty, you can trigger that doctrine of public reliance. And you have both a moral duty and a legal duty to act, unless your own safety is compromised. Now, once you begin to treat a patient, if you end that treatment inappropriately, for example, maybe you start to care for an injured child and then leave the child alone to handle another accident, or you leave a patient alone in the first aid room while waiting for their final transport, you may be guilty of abandonment. Now, we can contrast that with this legal term, negligence. If you do not perform up to your standard of training as provided in this course, you could be guilty of negligence. For example, maybe if you improperly place a splint onto a leg and it turns out that that causes further harm. Perhaps it's too tight and swelling of the injury causes some further complications later on. In that case, you've been trained to appropriately apply the splint. If you fail to do so, that could be negligence. Now, once a duty to act has been established, you have to finish rendering that appropriate care until final transport or final disposition of the patient has occurred. To do otherwise would be considered a breach of duty. Now, in all of these cases, it's really important to document everything that occurs. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. Later in this course, Chapter 8, we'll talk specifically about medical documentation. Doing a good job preparing such a document or an accident form is an essential part of your training and really critical to risk management at an accident scene. Now, through all of this, we can describe the assumption of risk. It's well stated, and for example, it's on the lift ticket that a skier or snowboarder purchases, that skiing is inherently dangerous. So that legal principle does provide some protection to us when someone chooses to participate in that sport, or if you're a bike patroller and they're downhilling, it's understood that those sports have inherent risks. Now, consequently, part of your documentation is to record what may have happened in an accident, in particular, how the accident was caused. Your documentation may be the only reliable source of information for reconstructing in court exactly what happened, even if it's years later. Doing a good job preparing documents is part of the risk management. We can summarize this way. OEC technicians have a moral and a legal duty to act. Failure to act can be a breach of duty. If you withdraw one's care, initiate the care, and then leave, you may be guilty of abandonment. If you perform inconsistent with your training, you may be guilty of negligence. And finally, if you place a person in a position where they may fear battery is potentially going to occur, that is assault. think of it as like confinement or not allowing a patient to refuse care. And then if you actually put hands on someone without their consent, that's battery.